haven't already done so. So those of you still remaining on, you might find yourself on the recording later, which will go up on YouTube, and a link will appear on the computer conservation site. Right, well, this evening's talk, well, actually brief, I should have mentioned, we're doing this at 6:30. Normally we'd have them at 5:30. We reckon by doing it at 6:30, because people don't have to travel to and from Manchester, it's a little bit of, it gives an option to get a few people who may still be working. Not that many of you are still working, I don't think, but one or two of you are, and it gives you a chance to get home and get onto this call. I'd be interested to hear from some people as to whether they found it's a bit late or whether it's working out quite well. Anyway, Professor John Wilson is the Pro Vice Chancellor of Business and Law at Northumbria University. Specialises these days in business history and corporate networks, it says on my bit of paper. He's been doing it for a rather long time, 40 years. It says published several books and an awful lot of journal and various articles about the evolution of British business over the last 250 years. Personally, I hadn't realised British business was going on for 250 years, but then what do I know? I just had a little chat with him earlier. A lot of those books do feature Manchester. John's a Preston lad. They spent a lot of time in Manchester, so Manchester is dear to his heart. So although he's up in the northeast, he does know quite a lot about the not so quite far northwest. Just looking at some of the books he'd written, according to the little article on the Northumbria University website, it would suggest that, John, you wrote a book called General Illness and Psychological Factors in Patients with Chronic Nasal Symptoms in a book of clinical otolaryngology, which I suspect is a computer getting very excited because somebody called Jay Wilson wrote it and they've attributed it to you.
Probably. Yeah.
So questions about ear, nose and throat later, maybe. Equally, and it's on Amazon, it has one of your books attributed to a Reverend John Wilson. So it sounds like you gain some and you lose some, really, as far as books are concerned. Anyway, Ferranti, I want to say Fujitsu, sorry about that. Ferranti, several of you, as we've been talking earlier, have worked for Ferranti and have very strong links with Ferranti over the years. Worked from Ferranti, which then the computer division certainly was, well, most of you know that I worked when they allow us in the museum, demonstrate the baby in there, which was then turned into a production machine by Ferranti as the first production computer. Many of you joined Ferranti slightly after that, or a long time after that, and then which then became part of ICT and ICL and merged onto Fujitsu. So clearly you have a strong interest in this. Most of you will know about Ferranti anyway. Personally, the first I knew about Ferranti when I was at school in Edinburgh, in 1970-71, I left in 71 to come to Manchester. I had a final year project, a physics project, and that involved me working with some guys at Ferranti Aerospace and Radar. Sadly, no longer there, but the buildings are still there, and it's now just a different company. So I have links to Ferranti going back an awful long time as well. But John has written 3 books about Ferranti, part 1, part 2, and the excitingly named part 3. But part 3 is called Management, Mergers and Fraud, which I guess really, John, is what you're going to talk about to us tonight. So as Roger said, questions by chat mechanism, turn off your video as I'm about to do. If you need to go out to rest breaks or whatever, please do. Don't bother to tell us, just go. And with that, John, over to you.
Thank you. Just give me a second while we load up. So is everybody happy with that? That's viewable?
That's looking good, John. Yeah, thank you.
That's fine, yeah.
Lovely. Okay, well, thank you very much for the welcome, and it's great to be here, and particularly to hear all the reminiscences about Gem Mill and West Gorton, Wythenshawe, all names that resonate very strongly with me, having walked into the Ferranti archive in the Easter of 1978, and I don't feel as if I've left yet. I'm still, here we are in 2020, and I'm still giving papers about Ferranti. As Bob said, I've written a 3-volume history of the company. I'll bet there's a lot of people in this audience who probably know more about Ferranti than I do in terms of working for them. But on the other hand, I'd like to offer some interpretations of and the title here is To Invite Disappointment or Worse, the Ferranti ISC merger, which the quotation, by the way, I'll come to a little bit later in the presentation. But I'll simply start by saying that Ferranti has dominated my life, and I wrote about Ferranti my PhD. I'm still writing about it. I'm still presenting papers. I've also written about the cooperative group. I've written about British Gas. I've also published more general histories about British business and about the making of modern management in Britain. So I have some general interests, as well as what Bob said, a very strong interest in Manchester industrial history. And I also note, I just saw in the audience there, Martin Campbell Kelly is here as well. And of course, he's the historian of ICL. And no doubt Martin will be teasing me later about some of the interpretations I put forward. But today's focal point, again, just to repeat what Bob said, is volume 3 of my study of Ferranti, entitled Management, Mergers and Fraud between 1987 and 1993. This book is still available, I believe, in Manchester University Press, published 7 years ago. And it was the culmination of what was an intense period of research. I'll say right at the outset, I didn't have much to do with the person who we'll meet later on, who was responsible for this fraud. He was in prison by the time I was doing this research, so it was very difficult to gain access to him, even though, as I'll say later, I did have some written correspondence with him. So maybe there is a bias in what I'm going to say, in that most of my records are Ferranti oriented. Sadly, I didn't get to interview James Gurin, but I'm not too sure it would have changed much of the story. So, who are we talking about? Ferranti, again, I'm sure this audience knows a lot of this, but I will go through this and just highlight some basic issues. Ferranti was, excuse me, I'm struggling with the top of the slide. Ferranti, good grief, so, excuse me, sorry. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about one of the most high-profile UK corporate scandals of the 80s, early 90s, directly as a result of a merger between Ferranti and International Signals and Control, a UK-listed but American company. I've described it politely there as opaque. Again, I'll say a little bit more about that later on, just what we mean by opaque. But the basic question I'm going to try and answer for you is, how and why did it end so badly for what was an enduring icon of British engineering? And again, I think many of us will share the sentiment that Ferranti had contributed extensively to the development of British engineering, not just in defence, but also in areas like transformers, in meters, and various other electronic and electrical equipment. And of course, computers were very much part of its profile from the late 1940s onwards, and not just mainframe computers, but of course the Argus process control computer and the digital systems computers produced down in Bracknell, largely for the Royal Navy. So why did it all go wrong? Well, let's start. I'm not going to start at the beginning, which was 1882, but I will say a few things about the nature of the business. First and foremost, until 1974, it was a family-dominated business. And that's a vital issue for me, that the family spirit of by this time, of course, it was the third generation. We'd had Sebastian de Ferranti, who started the company, Sir Vincent de Ferranti, who ran it from the 1930s until 63, and then Sebastian de Ferranti, who was chairman and managing director from 63 onwards. And that family spirit was very much part and parcel of the culture of the organization. I also coined this phrase, Ferranti spirit, which was very much about innovation in engineering excellence, but particularly in a decentralized group structure. In other words, Ferranti, the family, trusted the people it employed. It trusted the engineers, the scientists, the managers to get on with it and do the job for which they are best equipped. And that Ferranti spirit, I think, pervaded the organization right through its history, right until its demise in 93. And I still feel it survives today in many ways, not directly under Ferranti PLC, but certainly in an organizational sense. Sadly, in 1974-5, the company hit a major liquidity crisis. Again, the reasons behind that are pretty well rehearsed and largely attributable to a failure in the heavy transformer division and compounded by losses made in microelectronics. The simple end point about this crisis was that it pushed Ferranti into government control. The government provided not a huge amount of money in today's sense. I think the total government subsidy was only something like 15 million. When you consider the billions which we're currently spending upon coronavirus, it was a pretty paltry sum, but nevertheless, it kept Ferranti alive. It meant that Ferranti survived as a business, albeit, and this was the price of government support, that family influence was going to be diminished, indeed almost obliterated, even though they retained their heavy shareholding. And the two brothers, Sebastian and Basil, even in the late 70s, still held somewhere in the region of 20% of the equity of the business. Their influence over management was very much marginalized. Indeed, the board of directors was restructured, and a new managing director, Derek Allen Jones, was appointed. And as I say there at the bottom of that slide, very much to the annoyance of Sebastian de Ferranti. And in volume 2 of my history, I go into quite some detail, largely provided by Sebastian himself from his private correspondence, about how he tried to undermine Derek Allen Jones throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Ultimately resulting in Sebastian's departure from the firm and becoming a non-executive director of GEC. Almost a dirty word in Ferranti parlance. Excuse me, anybody who worked for GEC. So, what was Derek Allen Jones all about? What was he trying to do with the firm? Well, first and foremost, he wanted to improve the financial performance of the business. And this happened very quickly, but partly because of a fluke. Many people will know that Ferranti had a substantial subsidiary in Canada. And because of a huge surge in capital expenditure in North America, Ferranti Canada made an enormous profit in 1977-78. And suddenly, Ferranti, far from looking like a lame duck in 74, was suddenly a very profitable organization. Now, of course, Derek Allen Jones took the credit for this, particularly as this also coincided with a substantial restructuring of the business. For example, they closed down the heavy transformer business. They rationalized some of the so-called problem areas, which were basically the older departments of the business. And by 1978, such was the success of this restructuring that the firm was refloated on the stock exchange, and the stake taken by the National Enterprise Board, which has, of course, controlled the Labour government's equity holdings in many companies at that time, including British Leyland, another great success story. And that was sold off in 1980. And indeed, I've written a little bit more about that because the sell-off of the NEB stake in Ferranti was one of the first privatizations of the Thatcherite era. At the same time, however, it's important to stress, and I made this point a few minutes ago, the Ferranti spirit, i.e. that high level of innovation in a decentralized group structure, was retained by Derek Allen Jones. He realized that that was the source of real wealth. That's where the engineering innovation came from. That's where the new products came from. But at the same time, he also recognized that the UK market is okay. You know, the Ministry of Defence was buying an awful lot of material. I think Bob mentioned the great Crew Toll factory up in Edinburgh, which sold huge numbers of radar for successive generations of British fighter aircraft. But the biggest market for these products, of course, was the USA. So Derek Allen Jones embarked on a very ambitious, and I call it American strategy. And indeed, if you ever get a chance to read the board minutes, and I do intend to deposit the board minutes in the archive in the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, it is entitled, there is a paper on the American strategy. It started at a low level, buying up very small companies, usually in California, some in New York, very small companies, but accumulating over a 4 or 5 year period into something like $50 million worth of expenditure. Many of these purchases were not very successful. They were very small companies and didn't provide Ferranti with the massive entry into the US defense market, which Allen Jones required. And he was a little bit surprised at this. He thought that spending $50 million would gain him access to American defense contracts, but it never quite worked out that way. At the same time, another big influence on the Ferranti board, and in particular Derek Allen Jones, was a man called Robin Broadley. Now, Broadley was a senior executive in Barings Bank, and we all know where Barings Bank ended up. Robin Broadley had also been to school with Derek Allen Jones, so they'd known each other more or less for most of their life. And they became very close friends and business acquaintances through the 80s. The point about Robin Broadley is that he was prompting Allen Jones, A, to spend more of the profit of the business on dividends in order to keep institutional shareholders happy, and B, prompting more activity in the USA. So we see Derek Allen Jones frustrated by the first tranche of American acquisitions, that they didn't gain access to the big US defense markets. But at the same time, Robin Broadley was prompting him to be a lot more ambitious and penetrate the American market more effectively. At the same time, there's also clearly some strategic drivers at play. You'll remember that in the 1980s, the Thatcher government changed Ministry of Defence procurement regulations, introducing a much higher level of competition for Ministry of Defence contracts. Not a bad thing in itself, but certainly creating some difficulties for some Ferranti departments, particularly digital systems in Bracknell, where they were now competing against French and even American suppliers of digital systems. At the same time, Derek Allen Jones was having what he claimed was rebuilt Ferranti into what is a successful business. And there are comments in sources like the Financial Times that Ferranti became something of a darling of the stock exchange in the early 80s, that its share price was rising nicely. But at the same time, Allen Jones and the board of directors wanted to maintain independence. Now, you've got to bear in mind what is also happening in the 1980s. I put a little phrase in there, casino capitalism. We had the deregulation of the stock exchange, the so-called Big Bang of 1986. We have a huge wave of merger and acquisition activity. Institutional shareholders like pension companies, insurance companies are pumping more and more of their money into equity trading, albeit on a kind of short-termist level. But at the same time, this idea of casino capitalism was really catching hold in the UK in the 1980s. At the same time, a lot of companies, particularly American and European and even Japanese companies, were looking at Ferranti because it was this darling of the stock exchange. They were looking at Ferranti as a very good investment. So Derek Allen Jones said, well, how the heck do I resist this? Because I want to maintain independence. I want Ferranti to carry on as an independent company. I don't want to be part of a big conglomerate, however good that might be. And shareholder expectations at this time were also pushing Derek Allen Jones into more ambitious activity. I've already mentioned Robin Broadley, and in volumes 2 and 3, I do actually provide some quotations from the board minutes where Robin Broadley quite literally is saying, you must increase your payments to shareholders, otherwise you're vulnerable to a takeover. And this is why Derek Allen Jones moved for a massive merger like International Signals Control. Now, at the same time, Ferranti was, again, I think I'm trying to paint the picture here that by the mid-1980s, Ferranti was a major financial success story. I think it'd always been an engineering success story. By the 1980s, under Sir Derek Allen Jones, and he was knighted as a result of his achievements, Ferranti was in robust financial health. But what about ISC, or International Signals and Control? If you're ever in need of a good read at night, if you can't sleep, have a look at volume 3, because I do go into quite an extensive amount of detail. I've done quite a bit of research on ISC's early history. Founded, as it says there, in 1971 by James Gurin, and he more or less held all the equity in the business. And I've described him there as what I call a plausible entrepreneur. Because while ISC went through a rapid growth phase, James Gurin also spent an enormous amount of money as a local philanthropist in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was a lay preacher. He pumped money into a whole series of local activities. And when the crisis happened in the late 80s or 1990, people just wouldn't believe that James Gurin could be such a crook. But nevertheless, if you track back on the history of ISC, I've said there in very simple terms, it was a vehicle for the CIA for much of the 1970s and early 80s. They used ISC in order to provide weapons, defense equipment for many regimes in the Middle East, in Pakistan. And there are even stories which involves James Gurin with some of the big arms dealers of that era. But ISC nevertheless became so successful that it was able to float on the London Stock Exchange in 1982. It is curious in hindsight that Gurin chose London rather than New York to float the business, but nevertheless it was seen as useful in terms of providing additional liquidity for further expansion, because as you can see there, Gurin acquired other companies in the USA, in Italy. The ISC had a huge activity in Italy, for example. But this was all based upon sand and shifting sand. On the other hand, as far as Ferranti are concerned, this was the answer to Sir Derek Allen Jones's dreams of having a substantial presence in the USA. Here he is talking to James Gurin in the mid-1980s. In fact, the conversations actually start as early as 1981, but they don't really start to gather momentum until 86, 87. By that time, it's apparent that, number one, ISC is a success story, or at least people are saying that ISC is a profitable, successful business with an open door policy in terms of the US State Department and the defense activities of the USA. There was also very little geographical overlap with Ferranti. ISC tended to operate in countries like Pakistan, South Africa, the United Arab Emirates, China, Chile, and of course the USA. And at the same time, when they started these conversations, James Gurin literally invented, and I believe there is somebody in the USA who still owns the typewriter on which James Gurin typed out a whole series of fabricated contracts for multi-million-pound defense missile contracts. I'll leave it to you to believe whether or not that typewriter still exists, but the contracts did. But the contracts were completely fake. James Gurin built these, literally typed these contracts out himself in order to convince both Sir Derek Allen Jones and the London Stock Exchange that his business was based upon viable business. Coincidentally, when the merger happened, it was approved on Black Monday. I don't know whether anybody ever remembers that day in October 1987, but it was an interesting omen, don't you think? And that day saw the creation of Ferranti International Signal, which is a combination, a dominant, Ferranti dominated the business. They had 55% and ISC had 45%. But on the other hand, even though Ferranti had the dominant influence, shareholding influence, it was very unusual that ISC was allowed to continue as a separate company in the United States with its own proxy board and even its own executive committee on which no Ferranti director sat. Now, again, I'll leave it to you to judge why Sir Derek Allen Jones should agree to that. He was, of course, told that it was essential for American defense contracts. He was told by James Gurin, so I'm sorry, you just cannot have any British people on these boards, otherwise I might lose my big US defense contracts. Sir Derek Allen Jones believed this, he accepted this, as a direct result of which Gurin, even though he merged with Ferranti, he was effectively allowed to run ISC on his own for the next 3 or 4 years. And here they are. This is the photograph at the announcement of the formal merger. And Derek Allen Jones on the right-hand side, James Gurin, the lay preacher from Lancaster, as he often called himself. And as you see, the slide is entitled The Special Relationship. How special, we shall go on to see. So, how does the story unfold? By 1989-90, it was apparent that all the promises that ISC or James Gurin had made about these enormous missile contracts to the Middle East and to Pakistan, the cash flow from those contracts just wasn't happening. Indeed, so bad was it that in 1989, Ferranti issued its annual account, but within a week or so had to withdraw them. Because, and quite literally what happened there, by the way, is that Sir Derek Allen Jones flew across to see James Gurin in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and put him directly on the spot and said, what is happening with these missile contracts? To be told, sorry, Derek, they don't exist. I've interviewed Sir Derek about this. I've interviewed several people who were accompanied Sir Derek on that trip. And it's clear that when the accountants eventually had a proper look at ISC accounts, and they ran their own separate accounts as a division of Ferranti International, those assets, which allegedly these enormous missile contracts, were non-existent. So as a result of this, the 1989 accounts had to be withdrawn and reissued to show a loss of $230 million pounds. We now know that this was fraud at the highest level. And of course, James Gurin paid for it in 1992. And here he is. This is a photograph. This is James Gurin here at the podium. And this is a report by his local newspaper, who again just couldn't believe that their local business hero had been guilty of all this. And here he is actually defending himself, saying, well, in fact, all this is just a poor communication. He's actually trying to defend his activities. But of course, in 1992, he was found out and put in prison for 15 years in Tallahassee State Penitentiary in Florida. Derek Allen Jones, of course, also paid the price, and I'll show you a little later some cartoons, some rather cruel cartoons, which were published in 1989-90 and replaced by an American, a man called Eugene Anderson. But of course, even Eugene Anderson, supreme manager that he is or was, couldn't save Ferranti, and the business died in 1993. So, what happened in that period, 1989 to 93? Again, as you're probably all aware, most of the businesses were either closed down or sold off to GEC. Whether that's the right industrial solution, again, history will tell us, but Ferranti were under enormous political pressure to do this, largely because, particularly in Edinburgh again, they were carrying the contracts, the crucial forward-looking radar contracts for the new Typhoon jet. And had Ferranti gone bust, the whole Typhoon project could have gone up in smoke. So the Ministry of Defence put a huge amount of pressure on Ferranti to sell what was the jewel in the crown in Edinburgh. Similarly, we also have a whole series of asset write-downs, reappraisal of contracts, litigation settlements, and Eugene Anderson struggled enormously with the kind of financial problems that he'd inherited. As you can see there, the bank loans had to be renegotiated. They totaled 450 million at one stage, which was mind-boggling for Ferranti at that time. And of course, on a human level, we see a significant decline of employment from 24,000 to less than 4,000 in the space of 2.5, 3 years. Just some data for you. I won't go through this in any detail. I think it just demonstrates, particularly this blue line here, demonstrating how this went through the roof, demonstrating how they were totally reliant upon debt in order just simply to survive between the late 80s and early 90s. So let's come back to the core issue, which is about due diligence. It's about why Ferranti allowed itself to be hoodwinked into this merger. And I come back to the quotation which is part of the title of this talk, from a person called Argenti, writing in the mid-90s about auditing generally, where he said, not to look carefully behind the accounts as opposed to merely looking at them is to invite disappointment or worse. And I think this gets to the crux of the matter. Did Ferranti look at the ISC accounts with due diligence? Now, it is fair to point out here that the 80s, when all this happened in 86, 87, when the detailed investigations were happening, they were working under very different financial regulations. It was only after the 2007-8 financial crisis that the Financial Services Authority introduced more rigorous due diligence testing. So let's be clear that some of this could well be hindsight judgments. On the other hand, Ferranti placed its trust entirely in two things. One is James Gurin and what he told them about these enormous missile contracts and the alleged success of his business. And secondly, Pete Marrick Mitchell, the auditors. It is interesting, I think, that Pete Marrick Mitchell were chosen as the auditors of ISC, not the company which had served Ferranti for close on 80 years, a Manchester firm, Grant Thornton. Why Sir Derek went for Pete Marrick Mitchell, I think is clear. I think it was to provide respectability because this was a big international accounting auditing firm, as opposed to a Manchester firm, Grant Thornton, which didn't have the kudos or reputation of Pete Marrick Mitchell. But nevertheless, Sir Derek Allen Jones placed all his trust as the auditor of ISC accounts in Pete Marrick Mitchell, and we'll return to that a little bit later. At the same time, when eventually Sir Derek confronted James Gurin and it was revealed that the ISC accounts were a fabrication, two directors of Ferranti, Charles Scott and Alan Bardsley, were commissioned to do a report for the Ferranti board. But this report was based entirely upon research done by Fleming's bank, not by Ferranti board. And I'm afraid that report was not very reliable. It didn't get to the core of the issue. Another factor which I think is worth mentioning here, Ferranti wasn't the first company that James Gurin approached. He actually approached GEC, run at that time, of course, by Arnold Weinstock. For me, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of the 20th century. But Weinstock's number two, of course, his right-hand person is, I think, a man called, was it White? He had the good sense to send Gurin packing because Gurin refused to disclose any details of ISC's big contracts. And it's interesting how GEC's attitude was fundamentally different to that of Sir Derek Allen Jones, who trusted what James Gurin told him. But I'm afraid GEC's attitude to ISC isn't the only red flag. At the same time, Sebastian de Ferranti, who remember by this time is a non-executive director of GEC, Sebastian also commissioned the Lazard's Bank to do a report on ISC. And the Lazard's report isn't exactly as damning as some of the later reports, particularly the court cases in 91, 92. But the Lazard's report did reveal some fundamental problems with ISC activities to be ignored entirely by the Ferranti board. Sebastian de Ferranti's report, even though it was literally plonked on the desk of several Ferranti directors, was not even discussed at the Ferranti board meeting. Secondly, it is also clear now, and I've had this on good authority from senior executives, that the Ministry of Defence actually warned Sir Derek Allen Jones not to get into bed with James Gurin, largely because the Ministry of Defence was very nervous about giving clearance to some of the activities in which ISC was involved, especially in Pakistan, which at the time was on the United Nations blacklist. And finally, and this was John Major, before he became Prime Minister, of course, John Major, directing the HM Customs and Excise, also revealed to Sir Derek that he was very nervous about giving clearance for some of the ISC export activities. Now, again, coming back to the point I made earlier, is this hindsight? Is this, are we actually imposing 2020 judgment and the benefit of hindsight on what was happening to Ferranti in the mid-1980s? Here, I want to quote from the report on what's called the Joint Disciplinary Scheme, which is from the Chartered Accountants, the Institute of Chartered Accountants body, who did a report on Pete Marrick Mitchell's ISC audits published in 1996. And you'll see from those three quotations that the Institute of Chartered Accountants more or less absolved Pete Marrick Mitchell of any blame for the audit they conducted. So just to read them very quickly, they're saying it is not the duty of the auditor to check every possible piece of audit evidence, or PMM's audit work was reasonable, or Pete Marrick Mitchell were among those comprehensively deceived by a fraud which was designed and executed with extraordinary skill and care. And again, I'll leave it to you to make your own judgment on this, but let me just throw in a couple of factors. And I always call this the Rotterdam container episode. What I mean by that is that the Pete Marrick Mitchell auditor, who was responsible for checking those massive missile contracts which ISC had allegedly secured, was taken to Rotterdam and shown a container in Rotterdam docks, which Gurin's executives claimed contained the first missiles for Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates. The auditor never asked for the container to be opened. They simply ticked a box and said, that's fine, thank you very much, and moved on. In other words, the Rotterdam container episode reflects that first quotation. In other words, it is not the duty of the auditor to check every possible piece of audit evidence. Well, I'm sorry, but I would see this as a substantial piece of evidence that you want to actually see the product which ISC is claiming, because ISC are also claiming here an enormous positive cash flow arising from these contracts, and the auditor simply saw a container, not the product. A second factor of significance, I think, that even though Ferranti actually claimed £300 million in damages against Pete Marrick Mitchell, but Pete Marrick Mitchell, in an out-of-court settlement, paid Ferranti 40 million. Now, again, you can interpret that in different ways, but was that an acceptance of guilt, an acceptance that Pete Marrick Mitchell had not done the job that they should have done? Again, the Institute of Chartered Accountants said they did, but I'll leave it to your judgment as to whether or not they should have done more. Another issue I want to examine, and we're coming close towards the end here, please be assured, is the governance. Now, here again, we get on dodgy ground. Again, our current governance, corporate governance regulations are much tighter, and indeed they're some of the tightest in the corporate world. And you'd have to say that looking at the Ferranti board pre-Cadbury, the Cadbury innovations came in 1991, by the way. The chairman and chief executive roles were split. There were two separate people. There was a good representation of non-executives on the board. And in many ways, it looked like a nice balanced board structure. On the other hand, there are some issues here. Number one, very few of the executive directors held more than a small number of shares in the business. Now, again, this is often seen as an indicator of the commitment of a director to a business, that they might actually buy some shares and indeed invest substantially in the business. But very few of the executives, other than Derek Allen Jones himself, actually held very many shares. And indeed, it's clear from the board minutes that executive directors sold up any shares that they did acquire. They sold them off very rapidly, because if you remember, as I said earlier, the share price improved rapidly in the 1980s, and they cashed their chips in, to put it bluntly. Secondly, many of the executive directors were long-serving divisional managers who were, and not to put too fine a point on it, totally loyal to Sir Derek Allen Jones. And it is clear from the board minutes that there was very little challenge to key decisions, particularly on the US strategy that I outlined earlier on. There were non-executive directors, but the quality of those non-executive directors perhaps left something to be desired, in the sense of, again, not challenging the chief executive. And finally, and again, I come back to our friend Robin Broadley from Barings Bank. Robin Broadley actually replaced the NatWest Bank. NatWest had a representative on the board of directors of Ferranti's since the year dot, since the company started. But Robin Broadley, a representative of the City of London, was put on the board. And as I said earlier on, he was a heavy influence on Derek Allen Jones's strategies. Another point worth mentioning, the family management influence was marginalized. Even though, as I said before, the Ferranti spirit persisted throughout this period, and still in the late 80s, early 90s, it was still present, very much present. The family influence had been marginalized. Sebastian, if you remember, had left the company, joined GEC, to be replaced by his brother as non-executive chairman, Basil de Ferranti. But Basil, again, was non-executive. He didn't have any vote at board meetings. He was simply there to chair the meetings. And as soon as the Ferranti ISC merger happened in 1987, Basil was replaced by none other than Sir Derek Allen Jones. And the anecdote there is that Sir Derek Allen Jones only informed Basil in the lift going up to the annual general meeting when he announced that he was going to become chairman and chief executive of Ferranti International. Other issues, the classic dispersion issue. A lot of Ferranti shares were held by institutional shareholders. The issue there is institutional shareholders, as long as they receive their dividends, an improvement in share prices, are not going to interfere much with management. And investors were passive, to say the best, rather than short-termist. So in other words, looking at the situation in the mid-80s in Ferranti, what we're talking about there is that palpably or superficially, there are no real issues to cause any problems. But nevertheless, we have this merger. We have a merger between a very profitable business and a business built on sand. And I call it a naive merger. Why is it naive? Well, ISC, again, tracking back, and I could go through all sorts of data with you, but I won't bore you with that kind of detail. But just put it simply, ISC was valued at 411 million, which, again, when you compare that to Ferranti's the previous largest acquisition of $11 million, this was enormous activity. But Ferranti possessed no in-house experience or capacity to evaluate ISC, hence that reliance upon Pete Marrick Mitchell, which, as I argued earlier on, was misplaced faith, misplaced trust. And despite all appearances that the Ferranti structure looked sensible and appropriate, what we're arguing here, or I'm arguing, is that corporate governance at Ferranti was broken, that there was no interest from institutional investors, there were no effective external monitors, the family had disappeared, Alan Jones was effectively what in the literature is generally described as an entrenched US-style chief executive officer. In other words, what Sir Derek said happened, and there was very little challenge in the board and also by external sources like Barings Bank or the institutional shareholders to any of the decisions that Sir Derek was making. At the same time, corporate governance was going through some changes. Sadly, and I'll not go through those two quotations in any detail, sadly, those changes came too late. They didn't, the UK corporate governance wasn't tightened up from, was only tightened up from 1991 onwards. And sadly, this resulted in Ferranti disappearing down the plug hole as a result of one wrong decision. A decision which was never challenged by his board, a decision which was not challenged by his bankers, a decision not challenged by his institutional shareholders, allowing him to be duped by a person who had absolutely no scruples whatsoever in conning a British engineering institution like Ferranti into a merger that resulted in the demise of the business. And as I promised, a couple of cartoons to end up on an amusing note. Here's Sir Derek tied to one of the alleged missiles that ISC was supposedly selling to the United Arab Emirates and Pakistan. And here, if you can't see that text, there's Sir Derek reading ISC customer list and ISC accounts. And there's a photograph of Gurin on the right-hand side with a couple of darts on it. And the secretary is saying to Sir Derek, cheer up, Sir Derek. At least we can enter them for the Booker Prize for fiction. And finally, here's Sir Derek astride a Typhoon aircraft. And this is from the Financial Times. Sir Derek Alan Jones, management was misled by International Signal Order Book, which, as I said before, was literally typed out by James Gurin in order to con Ferranti into one of the biggest corporate scandals of the late 20th century. Thanks very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm more than happy to take questions and comments.
Right. I've had a few questions as we've been going along. The first one, perhaps from Bob. Do you think that a different auditor would have uncovered the fake contracts?
I'll answer that by simply saying a different process of auditing would have been more successful, and Grant Thornton would have done a better job than Pete Marrick Mitchell. Grant Thornton knew Ferranti, well, had known Ferranti for, I think it's the actual number of years is approximately 80 years they've been doing the auditing for Ferranti. And had they been given the job, they would have done a damn sight better than Pete Marrick Mitchell in investigating ISC's alleged wealth.
Thanks. Jonathan Aylan asks, do you think there are any lessons for Germany's recent Wirecard fraud?
When you look at any corporate scandal, it's this word trust, isn't it? It's the extent to which we trust what is in front of us. And in different corporate schemes, systems or different corporate structures, that trust ought to be interrogated much more intensely than it is. I think simply taking it for granted that this a so-called respectable source is providing with reliable information. I suppose to be personal on this, it's the kind of thing I tell my final year undergraduates or PhD students. Never believe anything you see in front of you. Question it, challenge it, look at it intensely. Don't just say that's fine, it's from a reliable source, let's believe in it. And I do feel that challenge and questioning has been at fault in a whole succession of corporate scandals from the 1980s right through to the present day.
Thanks. Another question, again from Bob. Do you think, from your experience of business, this is a one-off, or has it happened in other places as well?
I don't want to repeat what I've just said. I think this is a recurring feature of industrial capitalism. And a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, a co-author of mine, a man called Stephen Toms, who I think Martin will probably know. Stephen Toms has recently written a book on a history of corporate scandals. And there are recurring themes in there, which is about trust, which is about duplicitous behavior and naivety. And I've used the word naivety to describe the Ferranti ISC merger. And I think these are recurring themes of industrial capitalism. People want to believe that they're going to make a lot of money. And it's a major driver of international capital markets.
Sounds like there's a lot of con men at the top of some businesses and some governments.
I'm sorry to say, I agree with you 100%. And I'm not saying all chief executives are crooks. It's just that some crooks do seem to be very successful in persuading. And again, this tracks back. Well, you saw my one of the books. I showed a photograph of the 1720 to 1994. The reason why I choose 1720 is the South Sea bubble of 1720, which some see as the first great corporate scandal in the history of industrial capitalism. But sadly, lessons are never learned. And I'm sure there'll be others in the future.
John, Brian Russell asks why, if the ISC contracts were so important, why didn't somebody pick up a telephone to the purported customer and ask them about progress on the contract?
Right. Yes. Sorry, I keep selling volume 3 of my history, but yes.
Volume 4 will tell us.
Sorry. Right. I'll tell you. For example, in early 1989, Ferranti were getting wind that, well, the cash flow from these missile contracts wasn't exactly flowing into the Ferranti coffers. So they said, how about going out to the United Arab Emirates and talking to the Ministry of Defense? So James Gurin said, okay. He rushed around. He actually set up an office in some vacant tower block in the middle of United Arab Emirates, paid somebody to act as a Ministry of Defense official, set up an office with secretaries, with desks, with computers or typewriters, as it probably was then. Ferranti executives came along, met this person, and it's all the details in volume 3, met this person. This person told them the contracts existed, don't worry about it. There's just a bit of a cash flow problem with our bankers. The Ferranti executives went back to Ferranti, Millbank Tower headquarters, and said, it's okay, everything's fine. But they've been conned. They've been, and literally, James Gurin hired a con merchant to persuade Ferranti executives that the contracts existed and the cash would come into their bank eventually. I think some of you are looking askance at this and thinking, well, this can't be true, but it is absolutely true.
I can see Jonathan Aylan. Jonathan, you've got a question about Sebastian de Ferranti being tipped off. Would you like to ask the question?
Yes, quite simply. I never had the nerve to ask Sebastian himself, but obviously Sebastian would have known Arnold Weinstock very well.
Yeah.
He joined Arnold Weinstock's board. Arnold Weinstock was well known to have reservations about Gurin.
Yeah.
One can imagine that Weinstock and Sebastian would have had close conversations.
Yeah.
Sebastian had a major shareholding in Ferranti still. You would have thought that Sebastian would have, given particularly his slight enmity with Alan Jones, would have stirred it with the city.
Yeah. And indeed he did. As I said in my presentation, he commissioned Lazard's Bank to do a report. He sent that report to a few of his friends who were still on the board of Ferranti, then still Ferranti PLC. He did commission somebody to attend the annual general meeting of Ferranti PLC when the merger was being proposed and pushed through by Derek Allen Jones. But here's another anecdote. The person that was supposed to attend the annual general meeting and wave the Lazard's Bank report in front of all the shareholders got pissed the night before and missed the AGM. So again, you know, some of this is just incredible to believe. But in other words, Sebastian did kick up a fuss. The other point about his shareholdings, of course, is that he only held probably 1 or 2% by that time because he flogged off a lot of his shares to build his wonderful house.
Yes, wonderful indeed.
Absolutely. It's a masterpiece of Italian architecture. But that cost him a huge amount of money, as you could expect. And most of that came from Ferranti shares. And Sir Derek Allen Jones, by the way, claimed the credit for that because he said, I made Sebastian wealthy.
But can I come in with a follow-up?
Yes.
I've also heard from executives that were working in Ferranti's American subsidiaries that they too had their doubts about Gurin because they were familiar with the, how should we put it, the slightly mafia-style gossip and associations.
Right, yeah. Mafia style is almost too cruel, but on the other hand, he did have a very intimate relationship with the CIA and some of the darker corridors of the State Department. And yes, of course, that was again just James Gurin. He didn't allow anybody else into those conversations. And as I mentioned in the presentation there, that after the merger, he was allowed to keep a proxy board. And who sat on that proxy board? Directors and former directors of the CIA, senior American generals, retired, and 1 or 2 dodgy politicians from Pennsylvania. Again, so I come back to what I said. It is remarkable how all this happened without any repercussions with the repercussions for Ferranti as a business. Another anecdote for you. ISC had a big factory in the south of England. I've forgotten exactly where, but Ferranti executives once came along to try and gain access to this factory, to be blocked by security, and they refused them access on the grounds that they did not have US clearance to see what was inside. Of course, there was nothing inside. It was just a shell. But that was allegedly where the missiles were being constructed. Remarkable. But coming back to your point about Sebastian, Jonathan, I absolve him from any blame whatsoever. I think he tried his level best to undermine both Sir Derek Allen Jones and the merger, but sadly failed. And of course, by that time, his brother had died of cancer. Yeah. So his poor Basil never got a chance to block it, and Sebastian was thwarted constantly by the forces at play in 1987.
Philip Wardle had a comment about a comparison with GEC Marconi leadership. Would you like to say a word, Philip, as a question?
Yeah, I was just from the point of view that I spent a lot of time working in Marconi's between, well, I had two spells, actually, two separate spells, but over time, quite a few years working in Marconi. Many of us who worked there used to be frustrated because we could see business opportunities, or at least we thought we could. And of course, GEC was sitting on quite a big cash mountain during this period. We often felt that we'd like to encourage the company, in inverted commas, to invest its money in a proactive way and maybe move into business areas to counteract other areas where there were downturns. So with hindsight, it appears that in this case, a risk-averse strategy was perhaps the right way to approach the situation. I was very struck by, I think, the one slide which said, when there was no evidence that these contracts actually existed, it was time to just walk away. And that was evidently the right thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. I've already gone on record saying that I think Arnold Weinstock was one of the greatest entrepreneurs of the 20th century, and I'd stand by that. I think risk-averse is a man of contradictions. He did risk. He did build an enormous business. On the other hand, yes, I take the point about this. What was it in the 1980s? Something like £1.5 billion worth of cash in the bank, none of which was going into new ideas, new products, new processes. Clearly, that's a contradiction. But on the other hand, GEC was a success story. And I believe firmly that when Arnold Weinstock was obliged to stand down, that was the death knell, because under Arnold the business had flourished. Perhaps it is a pity that he didn't invest more, but on the other hand,
he did do some very good things. For example, he stamped out internal competitions where various systems company within GEC Marconi would compete with each other for the same contract, and you'd be in a race to the bottom. Right. I mean, that was a really good thing he did because we were just beating ourselves into the ground.
Right.
That was a good example of something really positive that he did do.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose that the other contradiction with my paper, my presentation, I said Derek Allen Jones was a kind of archetypical US-style chief executive officer. Well, so was Arnold Weinstock, wasn't he? He was what you might describe as a totalitarian ruler, and the way in which he used to have his divisional managers report to him every once a month on a Sunday demonstrated his power to control.
Well, some people used to drive their company Jaguars to Stanmore and find that they were walking home afterwards if it didn't go well.
Exactly. Yes, yes. Nobody would challenge Arnold.
John, one of the participants in the meeting, also called John, asked whether you have any sense of what motivated James Gurin, because it seems, looking at the case, he was always going in the end to get found out. So what was it that what was he trying to achieve?
Yeah, you say he was always, and he was always going to be found out, because we know from history that when something like that comes to the surface, the CIA pull out and say, oh, nothing to do with me, Gov. It's all down to this crook. So yes, he was always going to be found out. The man had an ego the size of Pennsylvania. There's a wonderful newspaper report, which I wish I'd have used more, because I was reading it this morning just to kind of freshen my memory, about how in Lancaster, I mentioned before, he was a great philanthropist. He spent a huge amount of money, and his own personal money, and probably some Ferranti money as well, I'm afraid, on churches, on social clubs, on a whole series of ventures supporting local employment. But he did this to curry favor with the local elite. He wanted to be seen as part of the elite of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or indeed Pennsylvania, or indeed the USA. And that ego drove him on and drove him to tell such porkies that you just wouldn't believe.
Thank you. Bob, I think we've reached the end of the questions that I've received. So would you like to conclude the meeting?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. This has gone very well. I see we've gone down to 84 now, but we had about 109 at one point, so that was
111.
exceptional. Brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Alan as well for setting this this meeting up. Thank you, Alan. And Alan was talking to me yesterday or the day before. He was saying he was trying to get hold of a copy of your third book. I'm not quite sure if he succeeded in the end, but they are a bit like hen's teeth by the sound of things, John. Anyway,
Sorry
thank you
about
very
that.
much. That's really interesting. We can add Mr. Gurin to our list of scandalous business owners, I think. But thank you very much.
Lovely.
Round of applause from everybody. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all again in the not too distant future. Thank you, Roger. Thank you,
You're
John.
very welcome.
And thanks very
everyone.
much for lovely questions. All the best.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye all.